Yes. Welcome back. We're here for session 3 of the March 2021 IAASB board meetings. And this third session is focused on the proposed LCE standard. And so we have a full draft and an issues paper and a mapping document that went along with this topic. And I thought I'd clarify some of my remarks that I made at the beginning of the week around my expectations for this project. People get fixated on my target date for ED being June. All of this is with the caveat that we will go where the board discussion takes us, and that nothing will be released before we have a proper assessment of quality and certainly its ability to get the desired feedback. And then at the time of which we have to assess whether there's a vote for an exposure draft, we'll have to do a cost benefit assessment of would this standard or draft standard benefit from additional board discussion, or is it ready to get feedback that could be useful and more beneficial than an additional board discussion. And in my mind, this also goes into our view that we're trying to set standards slightly differently using a more agile technique where we're getting user feedback earlier in the project. And all of this will be, I'm open-minded about when that should occur. I am conscious that in our feedback from the CAG, from the SMPAG, and the PIOB, there is certainly an emphasis on urgency to get the exposure draft out for public consultation so we can get feedback on it. And we could think about different formats on feedback too, about length of time and field testing, etc. But I just wanted to be clear that we will go where the board discussion takes us, and we are open-minded on that board discussion. And like on any standard we discuss, we expect robust discussion and meaningful input at each moment, and that we will ultimately, as a board, collectively reach the conclusion of whether something is ready to be an exposure draft or not. I do want to compliment Kai, Bev, Nikki for all the work and the task force's work to get the document in such great shape for our conversation today. And I look forward for the discussion today as well. I'll just pause here before I turn to Kai and see if there's any questions regarding what I just said. I see none. So again, we're very open-minded about where we go today. It's a crucial project, one of significant strategic consequence, as noted in our strategy and work plan. But again, this is why the board meets to discuss. So Kai, I turn it over to you. I look forward to today's session and tomorrow morning's session on the LCE standard.
Thank you, Tom. And similar to you, I also and the task force, we look forward to receiving the feedback from the board on our little baby that we've been playing with now for a few months after the board meeting in December. So we're really looking forward to having some good discussion and getting the feedback that could make us move the draft in even better shape for the targeted exposure. So I just want to express my thanks again to the massive work that's been done by Bev and supported by Nikki on the mapping, and then also the task force. I think we've met 6 times since the December board meeting, so there's been quite a number of hours been spent on this. I think some of the previous presentations on projects, if we go back to when we were in-person meetings, someone had slides up showing the number of miles and the number of places been visited on this different task forces. I think we can put up a big 0 zero number of miles been flown. So on an environmental friendly project, I think we're really moving forward and progressing on that as well. So by that, I think
we may need an EER report on this project when we're done.
Yeah, we can see if we can do that. And then Michelle, you can move to the next slide. If you remember back to December, we had the mountain. I think it was Imran that brought up that we're trying to climb a mountain that's never been climbed before, and we're moving up the mountain. You can see the Viking here has moved a bit further up the mountain. I think we're closing in on something, so hopefully you agree that we've progressed and that we're getting closer to be able to publish the ED. So you can go to the next slide. This is just a short reminder of what we did in December. As you all remember, we approved the project proposal that set out the principles for the standard based on the ISAs. We had support. We also presented the initial working draft and had support on the direction. We had some questions and got feedback from the board on some specific areas, which we've now progressed in the draft that you have in front of you. That was especially around applicability, where we have addressed that, and also around quality management, ISA 220. We also got feedback on the mapping, and we've done some heavy lifting on the mapping documents that you've received. And our intention for this week is to walk through the standard from front to beginning, getting your comments and feedback on what we have. If there is time towards the end, we will also then go into the mapping documents to see if there are any specific concerns on what's been presented in there. If we don't get to that at the end, I think the most important part for us is to get the feedback on the drafting itself, and you probably will raise any significant concerns you have when we go through the different parts. So if there is no time, feel free to send through your comments on the mapping and also the other parts written to me and Bev, so we have that and help us for progressing the draft forward. And as Tom just said in the beginning, we're still working towards the exposure draft being approved at the June meeting. So we're still positive. I think that we can do the work, but I think it also depends on the feedback we get from you, and hopefully get the constructive feedback that can progress this to where we need to be. So we can move to the next slide, Michelle. On the slide here, we have some of the areas that we've done some of the changes in. You can see in the draft you have that the standard now has a name. It's now called the International Standards on Auditing for Audits of Financial Statements of Less Complex Entities, ISA for LCE. So if you have any comments on that, feel free to raise them when we go into the preface. We've also then worked some further on the drafting principles. As we said in December, we progressed what we had in December by looking at the drafting principles, trying to fix some of the more complex paragraphs and sentence structures. We have been working with the CUSP group to see what the drafting principles are there, and when they come out, we will work on this even more. And I think that even though we have done work on the drafting, there is still some left to be done. We know, for example, we said that we wanted not to have sentences or paragraphs with multiple shells. There are some instances of that still. Some of them we think we can fix. Some of them, the second shell is dependent on the first, or contingent on the first one, so they may be still applicable to be written that way. I think you can also see that we started using some symbols on use of professional judgment and documentation. In the reference group, we got some mixed feedback on that, so I think it will be important that we get the board's direction on that as well. One of the things we discussed in December was around definitions. If we had to include them in the standard itself, or in a different way could tie them back to the standard. We've now tried doing that in part 1.2, where we've linked the standard in the definitions into the standard, so we can have some feedback on that when we get to that part. We also done work on the essential explanatory material. As you've seen from the draft, we've taken away the numbering to distinguish it even more from the requirements themselves. We also had some principles on developing them, and there are two different types. As you can see, one of them is explaining or connected to the whole part. They may be presented just after the heading, and then if they're connected to a specific paragraph, they follow the paragraph that they're connected to. We've also added more based on the comments that we received. I think the board when we move forward, we need to caution against also just adding more for the sake of adding, and it needs to be balancing the actual need and the benefit of adding more material. Introductory boxes, we've looked at them as well, so now they should be consistent, and they set out the principles for the content that follow in that part. We have planned some supplements around reporting. As you can see, when we come back to the reporting sections, we are planning to have supplement reporting guide to address some of them, or to take away the need to include a lot of the auditor's reports in the standard itself, and have a supplemental guide where we can have more guidance and make it even more useful. I think this is something we got feedback from some of the task force members. So I think that they have in Canada, and I think also other countries have, and it's very they like it very much where it's done. As you see, the mapping documents, two massive documents that you've gotten, they've been reworked a bit. We've had discussions with IAASB, and we now we've taken some inspiration from what they've done around what they call the alignment principle, and that's what we used to decide if to bring a requirement in from the ISAs, if it's relevant. If it is relevant, should it be tailored or not towards the audits of LCEs? And then if we tailor it, the last question we ask ourselves, do we still meet the same output and the assurance level? So you can move to the next slide, Michelle. As I said, we've done lots of work, as you can see from the papers you received, but there are still some work to be done. We think that we need to do some more work around the last parts on the reporting and concluding sections. Some of that is based on some of the questions that some of the questions we ask for you, the input we ask from you on this meeting, where we try out the alternative with using the supplemental guide, but then also the direction for the auditor's report and how that should look and feel. Around information technology and automated tools and techniques, we need to do some more work as well to maybe more how we can promote the automated tools and techniques in the standard around information technology. If the work that we've done also, we will test it on some experts in that area so that they can, if they agree that it's still fit for purpose. Public sector, we need to do some public sector considerations, not to inadvertently scope them out in the applicability section, and to see if there are further considerations that should be built into the different parts in the standard itself. One of the other topics is transition from the ISA for LCE to the ISA itself. That is an area we know we need to do some work and to include. So that's coming in the next round. As I said, the supplements we discussed, and also the outreach plan. I think as Tom outlined in the beginning, when the standard goes out for exposure, we need to do quite a lot of outreach, since this is also targeting somewhat a different group to give comments, and also to make sure that we get the feedback that's needed. So you can move to the next slide. So if you remember back in December, we had a big discussion around applicability and whether to include group audits or not. We decided to scope them out. But we also said that we will have a separate focus on that in the explanatory memorandum, and show in that part, show the options for how much, or get some feedback on how much to include, and how that could be presented in the standard itself. That will be the focus for a specific focus on a call in May. I think it's 10th or 11th of May that we will have a specific meeting on that. When we had the outreach prior to this meeting, both with the S&P AG and the CAG, we got some strong concerns that scoping out groups of the standard may inadvertently scope out a lot of entities that should or could be able to use the standards. So they had some strong concerns on that. I think our suggestion is still that we move forward with the approach that we outline here. I think that would be the most beneficial. Also considering that ISO 600 is still very much in play, and it would be difficult to preempt some of the decisions that's there, and it could be difficult to address going in. So that may be the best option for us going forward. So as I said, the focus for the May call. So we can move to the next slide. As I said, last week we met with the CAG. We got very good feedback from the CAG. They're pleased with the progress of the standard and very happy with the direction. They have, as I said, strong concerns about group audits and excluding them in the applicability. In the applicability, there are still some people, or we have support for excluding listed entities, but they also feel we need to follow closely the IAASB PI project to see where they end, and to see if that our decision should change based on that. Sorry. We also got support. They said the standard needs to be aligned with the ISOs, and then also to be considered how to transition. So they supporting that we're following the ISOs doing this, and that will help transition back and forth from the standard. On the reporting, there were some suggestions on the transparency around the judgment to use the standard, if you should include that up front. And then also we got some suggestion to further distinguish the report from the ISA audit report, so it doesn't look and feel exactly the same, even though we're referring to a separate standard. Should it even be more different than an actually ISA report looks? So Jim, I don't know if you want to add something to this summary?
See, Jim is.
I don't know how much did I. Yeah, I don't know how much that I want to add, but I do want to emphasize certain areas. And one was there really was a strong, I would say, a strong reaction by some members of the CAG about excluding group audits. So I think the phone call that you referenced will be a very important one. But I definitely heard from CAG members on that. Also, there was one thing that I didn't see in here, and that was a discussion of whether the key audit matters, critical audit matters would be included, or should they be included for an LCE? And I hadn't seen any discussion on that. So that might be one for the board to consider. Thirdly, the governmental issues, I think are pretty challenging, because it's very hard to scope in an entire industry, if you want to call it that, or scope it out. So I think there's going to be some, ultimately, I think the board's going to have to give judgment in terms of public sector entities and whether they're assessed in and out. I think that's a very challenging area. And then finally, there was, as you referenced, a lot of discussion on when do you transition back to the ISAs, and I think some clarification on that. All that being said, I sense there was an enthusiasm, and I think June really might be a date that can be reached, and so I just thought I'd point those things out. Thanks, Kai.
Thanks, Jim. And I think looking back to the comment on the ISO 701, I think the question to exclude 701 from the standard, and we've said that you could use 701 and then you have to include that completely from the ISOs. And I think I got the same feeling as you did, and even the PIOB said that they look forward to the ED being released, and it's the need for the standard to be out of exposure.
Well, I don't know, Kai, with that point, you spoke for the PIOB. We actually have the PIOB on the call. So Carol, do you want to say anything at the top, or do you want to reserve your comments?
No, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for giving me the floor, because I wanted to say at the outset that I'm very impressed with the work which the task force has done. This is a great job, and congratulations for that. I would even say that this document is of higher quality than the standard for SMEs in the IS framework. IFRS for small entities, which has not been a success. I think this standard will become a success. I think you are really on the right track, and I believe that it's therefore very important that the board would be able to conclude the work so that in June the exposure draft can be released. I think people are definitely waiting for this. It will increase the attractivity of the ISIS tremendously, and it would really be in the interest of the board to do that and to be able to release the exposure draft in June. So I just confirm your point, Kai Morton, that this is really important for us. It is in the public interest that this gets released so that people can comment on the great work that you have done so far.
Thank you very much for the support and the kind words, Carol. Yeah, Tom, do you want to come in?
No, I was just going to turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks. You can move to the next slide, Michelle. So, as I said, we've traveled 0 miles, but we've done a lot of outreach. As you know, we have the reference group where we test out some of the drafting and the thoughts that we have during the development. So we had multiple calls with them as well. And as you can see from the issues paper, some of their comments and feedback has been included in the issues paper. As I said, we had a call with the SMP AG discussing the draft. And from that call, they also have they sent a letter afterwards supporting the development, and they, as I said previously, they also look forward for the exposure. We had with the CAG. We also had discussions with the representatives from ICAW, both on the applicability, but also some of the pain points and how we can make the standard even more applicable and suited for an LCE environment. Based on some of those discussions, we did some work in the risk assessment and, let's say, the 315 section. As I also started with earlier, we had a call with IAASB to learn from their, have some learnings from their development of IFRS for SME and the reviews that they had, so we can learn some of that. From those discussions, we've taken, as we said, the alignment principle on the mapping. We also looked in some other areas where we got some more ideas on how to further develop the standard, as you can see from the preface. And so when we get there, we had a call with representatives from IDW to hear the status and where they're going on their project to develop a separate standard for audits of LCEs. And we had coordination with other IAASB task forces as the ISO 600 around group audits, and also the CUSP group. Outreach that is coming, and we have the formal firms next week, and then we have scheduled a meeting with the IFR IFR standard working group also coming, and then the output or the outreach that when the standard is out for exposure that we need to plan for further. So then we can move to the next slide. I think that was the overall comments I had in the beginning. So we can now start with going into the standard. I think as we outlined in the issues paper, we'll take from front to the back, and then we'll start with the preface. I think in the standard, when we started the development, we started based on the strawman that's been developed from the unofficial or the working group that was before we had the working group here, and we have identified some hangover paragraphs from that that we will look at and take out to see if they will stay or not for the next draft, and then we can progress that further. So I think you can take down the slides, Michelle, so we can see each other better. I don't think we need to have the questions up. I think we will start with the preface, and then as you can see, the preface is new. It's replacing the introduction, the structure, and the inspiration that we've looked at the IFRS for SME, and our structure is quite similar. The applicability has now its own section and forms part of the standard. In the preface, we highlighted the role of individual jurisdictions, that they can further restrict or limit the use of the standard so that they have a role to play, and that they can play in the applicability. As I said, this is where also we outline the symbols for professional judgment and documentation. So we'd like some feedback on that. And also we've added a new section around the maintenance of the standard, and that we outlined that we will have a stable platform. The standard will be updated no more frequently than every third year, or once every third year. Yeah, I think that's basically what I wanted to highlight from the preface. So Tom, I can switch it back to you so that we can get some feedback on the preface, and also on the use of symbols and the approach to the maintenance of the standard.
Okay, preface, use of symbols, maintenance. I have a just general comment, Kai, because I know it's inevitable. People are going to want to comment also on an overall basis, and if we don't give people an opportunity to do that. So do you mind if people have sort of general comments right now about approach and the preface, that we could use this opportunity for it? Otherwise, people will ask me to do it anyway. So general comments and the preface, use of symbols, approach to maintenance. Okay, lots of hands coming up. I'm just looking at the list. Kaiue.
Good evening, and thank you, Tom, and Thank you, Kai Morten. Indeed, I have a general comment. I would like to thank first Kai Morten and the task force and staff for the tremendous amount of work that was undertaken to prepare the papers for this meeting. Let me say from the outset that I'm a strong supporter of the development of an auditing standard for audits of LCEs as soon as possible. I understand that the task force believes that the papers should form the basis for the issuance of an exposure draft of the LCE standard in June. I have a number of serious concerns with that way forward. First of all, we received the draft standard and issues paper effectively on the 28th of February, and the mapping documents effectively on the 4th of March. Without the mapping documents, however, it was for me and my TA very difficult to perform an analysis of the proposed standard to understand and evaluate some of the issues addressed in the issues paper. All four of the documents together represents over 550 pages that need to be read and analyzed on the basis of the mapping documents in less than 2 weeks. If the IAASB were a full-time job for its members, this would have been difficult enough, but we do this work in addition to our job. It seems to me to be unreasonable to expect board members to undertake a detailed analysis of the documents to be able to provide the task force with the comments it needs to turn around the documents so as to issue an exposure draft in June. I'm concerned that board members will not have enough time to give the documents the attention they deserve, so that due process has been served for issuing an exposure draft in June. Second, based on the analysis that my TA and I have done of the mapping documents so far, there are a large number of potential issues with how the requirements in the ISAs were converted into the LCE standard. I'm afraid that sometimes the logic behind some of the requirements that were not included, or for the inclusion of other requirements, remained opaque to me based upon the reasons providing in the mapping documents. Sometimes the wording was supposedly simplified, but actually changed the meaning of the requirement. In other cases, the requirements were changed to adjust them from an audit of LCEs, but the reasons for the adjustments due to an LCE environment escaped me. In still other cases, no simplification of the audit approach was undertaken, even though simplification might be considered, particularly with regard to risk identification and assessment. We are running the risk that we issue an exposure draft of a standard. The exposure draft will be taken apart from different perspectives because the underlying reasoning for the changes is not always clear. For these reasons, even though I'm a great supporter of developing an LCE auditing standard as soon as possible, I have mentioned it, I believe seeking to issue an exposure draft in June that finds broad support in the board is likely to premature in terms of due process and therefore may not be in the public interest, despite the pressure from some stakeholders for the issuance of a standard sooner rather than later. Consideration might be given to providing a discussion paper with a list of issues for stakeholders with the background material of a draft and the mapping documents in an so-called invitation to comment. But to me, in September, not in June. That's my general comments, Tom. I'll give back to you. Thanks.
Okay. Len.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Kai, and the task force and staff for the amazing amount of work and outreach you have done. So, some high-level comments also reflecting on Kai, your excellent presentation. I think all along, I think I support the direction of the task force, and so based on reading of the materials, I continue to support. But also mindful that we are in uncharted territory. I don't think any one of us have gone through this exercise before as a board, knowing that we are temporary board members. There's no permanency seat on this board. So I'm actually continue to stay open-minded. I think since we haven't gone down this path before, we need to be open-minded. I think Tom said that earlier in the opening remark, we need to be more agile. So I'm looking forward to some of the comments and discussion in the next day or so in terms of some of the specific issues. That's my overall comment. On specifically ISO 600, I thought I came away from December meeting. There seems to be a lot of support to scope out ISO 600. So I continue to think, that's a position I'm taking. But listening to the CAG discussion last week and also some of my internal outreach, there seems to be a lot of support for ISO 600 to be reconsidered. But Kai, I think I'm in the same shoes as you are. In ISO 600 is a moving target, and our task force has been working on scalability and also scope and applicability. So probably between now and May, we should at least between the two tasks, we need to have a good discussion. Also based on the discussion on Friday when we talk about 600. On the preface, pretty happy with where you have in the preface. Okay with the symbol, but I do have a question about the maintenance part. We're going through standards, all the time on this board. So to set it on a not frequent, no less than 3 years or no more than 3 years, seems to be not reflecting in terms of the ISO standards we're going through on our timetable. So every time we issue a new ISO, we need to think about how we incorporate that into the LCE standards. So so on the maintenance part, maybe give more considerations. That's my overall comments. I'm looking forward to all the input in the next day or so, and stay open-minded. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel.
Yes, hello everybody. Today it's March 16, but 3 years ago, on March 14, 2018, we were, some of us, in Amsterdam, and we had an executive session on LCE, and it was the start of a journey. And it's amazing to see all what we have done and all that the task force have done and how much we have collectively, we, the IAASB members, but also a lot of people around us, how we have matured on this topic to be able to develop and to discuss and soon to issue a draft standard to deal with the audit of less complex entity. So again, congratulations to the task force. Of course, we still have some comments, but really the project is in a very good shape and very happy to see the train leaving the station on this topic. Over this process, as you know, we had already 2 Paris conferences, And as you know, we are looking forward hosting in some way a third Paris conference, the last act of this opera, as it was explained at that time, to work on this draft. And so we are looking forward to, with the French profession, CNCC, CSOEC, to work with the IAASB in some way to organize a platform to discuss on this draft standard. So we are not against releasing it in June, because we think that the more opportunity we have to discuss with a wide range of stakeholders, the best. And maybe one option could be to have a longer period for discussion, also because we are still in between virtual events, maybe sooner physical events, but it's not yet life as usual and may not be life as usual in fall. But maybe a longer time and a lot of interactions with many stakeholders to get some feedback in order to work then after on the final draft. Also, a feedback I wanted to give you is on the size of the standard, because we have heard a lot of the size of the standard. And if you remember, there was a kind of competition among the standard setters, and it was the country that will have issued the shortest standard. And I think to that extent, France was not too bad because it's 20 pages, I think. So it was interesting for me to see the feedback of the people seeing a standard of 90 pages. Because if at the beginning we had said, let's have a standard of 90 pages, I think a lot of people would have escaped saying, it's not what we want something much shorter. And the interesting feedback I got was, no, it's fine. 20 or 90, it's not a big deal. It's still short. It's still much shorter than the full set of ISAs. And when we read it, we have everything we need. We don't have the feeling that we have too much, except in one section that I will cover later. But compared to the 1,700 pages of the full ISAs, 90 pages, for less complex entities, having just the core requirements, it's okay. So it's also something I wanted to share with you and with the task force. My fourth point, and I don't know if we will have the opportunity to discuss it today, or if it's for June, or even if it's for the exposure draft. I immediately noted that you labeled the standard an ISA for an ISA for LCE. Up to that meeting, we had not given that name voluntarily. We have avoided to do that, saying, let's see if it's one ISA, if it's part of the ISA series, or if it's standing on its own somewhere else. I'm not against, but I would like to have the opportunity to discuss this labeling of ISA for LCE. So happy to do it now, or to have an open question on the exposure draft. But I think the positioning in the ISA category has some consequence that we need to agree on. And last but not least, and it will be similar to the feedback from Len, I'm not sure committing to revise the standard only once every 3 years is workable and is public interest. Just imagine the IAASB issues a very important standard with a very important modification to the requirements or new requirements. I would be personally very uncomfortable to have to wait 3 years to see audits perform applying the ISA for LCE having that standard. It's not an accounting standard, so it's not providing more or less information or booking something one way or another. It's really a standard of quality of performance. So I will not be comfortable to commit to update only every 3 years. Maybe for many modifications, once every 3 years will be fine. But if needed, I believe that we should have a possibility to update more often if needed. Thank you.
Just a point of clarification, which I know it's the preface, but on the original slides, we talked about the title Is this the area that you'd like feedback on the title as well? Okay, so Isabel, if you did have a view on the title, other than it's something that we should be understanding the consequences of the title, please feel free to interject here.
So no, I just wanted to say, because I think it has some consequence on some of the debates we will have later in the day. For example, the debate about the definitions. If it's an ISA and the glossary is there, then it's not an issue, because the glossary is already there for the ISAs. If it's somewhere else, maybe we have to think further. So that's the kind of consequence that we need to have in mind. I'm not against calling in an ISA, but I just want to ensure that we're all very comfortable with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you for raising that to remind us it's a topic. Lynn.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Kai Morton and the team for what is a tremendous amount of work in a short time. My overall comments are, I started being doubtful whether it was possible to pull this together, and I have to say I've been really impressed by the work that's been done and the quality of the product we have in front of us. And I think it is in the public interest that we do get this out quicker rather than later. So I'm certainly in the camp of exposing this to public comment, because the proof of this is whether it's going to be useful for people doing less complex audits. And we can have one opinion, but our broader community's input is going to be extremely valuable there. In terms of the preface, I like the symbols. They do, I think, add, and except there needs to be some consistency. They're not used consistently throughout the document. 3 other points. When I initially read through the document, I found the blue boxes with the EEM irritating. They seemed to interrupt the flow to me. But by the time I got to the end of the document, I was comfortable with them and thought they were valuable. But I did wonder whether a version without them might be helpful as well. In terms of maintenance, having a 3-year maintenance review period and then 18 months after that for implementation is effectively 5 years, and I just am uncomfortable with that. I'm presuming that there would be conforming amendments in the meantime if there was a major standard revised, but if there wasn't, being 5 years out of date, I would find of concern. And finally, and I'm not sure whether it goes in the preface or in part 1, but I think the transitioning issue between this standard and the ISAs should be up front, not buried down in the bowels of the standards. So a section on transitioning between standards, I think, would be useful. But overall, very impressive work, and thanks very much to the team for this draft. Thank you, Tom. That's all I have to say.
I wanted to also, there was a point of clarification probably to Isabel. She talked about length of exposure period. Like, again, none of this will be determined till the point in which we actually agree that an exposure period is appropriate, and you approve a document, but the thought was that it would be approximately 6 months or so, because if you got it out in July, you certainly wouldn't do it to end in holiday period. And, we always thought it would have to be a longer period. So we were talking 6 months. That would also include opportunities to do field testing and other forms of consultation in the process. So that's a working hypothesis. Everything is subject to discussion, and also subject to the point at which you actually make the judgment on the comment period is the point at which the ED gets ready to go out. But again, all working hypotheses. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and Kai as well. I'm very supportive on the direction. After hearing all the comments from Isabel, probably I just have to say agree, and that's it. She was very thorough commenting and giving all what we are living in practice and the big expectation that everyone has outside. I can share that people are asking quite often about the progress of the project, what is going to happen, when is it coming, how the standards looks like, the size, the content. So the ones that actually do audits and are involved in a everyday dealing with clients and struggling really to complete the job are very excited about this. Also very impressed that less than 90 pages are pretty much summarizing all the 1,500 pages that we have in the standards. I like the way it reads, it flows. You really enjoy going through the 80 pages in a short couple of time, which is pretty good because once you think that we have a basic understanding of the standard, it's really a good reading. I agree with Lane in terms of the blue boxes. Sometimes I think there's a way to maybe shorten them a little bit. I think that once we have a box over 10 rows, it's too much. And actually also agree that sometimes you don't even need to read them. If you understand the requirements, it's pretty easy just to skip those boxes and keep going with the rest of the standard, and it's even an easier read. In terms of the preface, I like it. That's fine. Agree with the with the listed entities scoped out. Group financial statements not quite clear, and actually I was wondering if the decision is really to scope out group audits, could you still report using NISAs and then have that component and statutory audit executing the job with this ISA for LCE? Not clear to me in the papers, but I think it's a point for discussion later. I have some suggestions on the basic estimates. I struggle a little bit with the concepts and how they really link into the whole of the standard. Also agreed that the time for revision probably should not be 3 years. I think once the ISAs are really revised and during the process of exposure, there's also maybe a chance to mirror a project for LCE and update the standard, because we need to take the benefit of having the same level of rigor. I understand that maybe the big difference is really extent of documentation and maybe executing less procedures when they are not really applicable for LCEs. And I think in general, Tom, those are, I guess, my general comments. Thanks, Guy.
Okay, thank you, Fernando. We'll hold off on further applicability comments to the next round, but we'll table your comments on that point when we get for the next round. So we won't forget them. We will respond to them in the context of the next round. Okay, Josephine.
Thank you. Just tremendous work. Thank you so much, Kai and the task force, Bev. Clearly, so much has gone into this, and I echo Kai's comments as he started responding with overall marks that there is so much work that you can see here, and therefore it has for us as well been a struggle to get through all the papers and cover everything off, but we're still working on it and have tried to get some high level points across, and we'll certainly send everything to you once we've completed our review. So thank you, tremendous thanks. I've got quite a bit on this area. I'll start with the maintenance standard because I agree with Isabel and Len, and I think Fernando says as well. I think it's much more sensible that changes are made as consequential amendments or conforming amendments as we do with our other standards. That's a much better approach. I am worried, as with Isabel, that we'll have something major happen in a standard and we won't see it in the LCE standard for quite some time. So supportive of those comments so far. In terms of the title of the standard, I'm actually really uncomfortable with the use of ISAs in the title of the standard. I understand why we might want to say that and record it that way in a report, but to give the impression that this is a reasonable assurance engagement and it has the same robustness as an ISA in that less complex space, but I'm not there yet. You know, for a start, you've got some circular complexities in an ISA given the authority attached to an ISA. It's not a supplementary standard, it's not 600 or 501, nor is it a standard that sits within the ISA journey. Application material is very much part of our ISAs and have to be read in with the requirements. And that's important for encouraging understanding and consistent application. There's no application material in these standards or very little. And in my view, not being clear that this is not an audit under the current ISAs is actually undermining the transparency we're trying to achieve with reporting and potentially misleading users. So to try and put my thinking hat on, I think in this sense, it's better to call it something like the International Standards for Less Complex Entities and give it number 1, and call it Audit of Historical Financial Statements. And then you have some space there to do other things for LCEs in the future as well. But I really did not respond well, apologies, to the title being an ISA. Now I recognize, Tom, that you wanted to sort of park some of the points to scope and applicability, but there's 2 aspects of my views on scope and applicability, some of which are very similar to what Kai had mentioned at the beginning, Kai Morton. So the range of entities that's included as potentially being audited under this standard, in my view, is still far too broad. And putting the professional judgment matters aside, we're talking about everything below listed. That's a phenomenal number of entities subject to audit, and that's bordering on the slightly complex or nearly complex to the really, really small, the latter which I thought, or I initially thought, we were really trying to focus on. So when we think about the fact we're still hearing of audit quality issues in that non-listed space just as much as the listed space, we do really need to take this into account when we're thinking about whether requirements are relevant, and of course including or excluding, in fact, all the application material that supports those requirements and delivering a quality audit. So with this in mind, there are a couple of consequences given we're on this journey with a view to meeting June. So first, on scoping, I do think we do need to tighten up the scope a lot more. As Kai said at the beginning, I would agree that given IAASB have been through a significant process in determining this list of PIs and believe that that list is the group of entities that are subject to more robust independence requirements, then we should at least consider that they would be, therefore, in terms of audit quality, and I would include those in the scope. And given that we're all going through this journey with IAASB around the same period, there's no harm in including that in the scope and following their path. But this is still very broad scope, and it's not helped by the other characteristics of LCEs being left to professional judgment. And then just touching on some very briefly, so the areas subject to professional judgment have far too much flexibility. For example, we have an entity that might be using very simple commercial software and doesn't have access to the source code, but at the same time that entity is applying a Black-Scholes model. Now, I don't think a model being well known is necessarily a good reason to assume that it's not complex. Black-Scholes is very difficult. It requires knowledge of probability, functional analysis, and partial differential equations. and as well as some knowledge about mathematical modeling of financial markets. So to me, that entity, if they're applying that, should really be in the more very complex space of ISO 540. So then you might have respondents question, well, why do we have so many of 540 requirements in there? Well, because we're assuming you're in very complex modeling here. Or another example is the share-based payments, for example. They can be less complex, I agree, but not if there isn't an observable market price. So once you move out of that market price and the availability of that, you're into complexity. And again, then you're bringing in all those requirements of 540 that are relevant to that. So it's about really, really funneling down what we really want to, what we're really looking at here. There was another point on governance structures. I got a little bit confused whether the audit committee was in or the audit committee wasn't in. So I would expect not, but then I do believe that the CAG, someone at the CAG did mention that you can have very small entities with audit committees. So you are a little bit in a rock and a hard space on that one. But so taking all that in mind, it's very difficult for us to work out which requirements should be in, which shouldn't. Even if we tighten up the scope further, there are still too many unanswered questions and a mapping and a scoping in my mind, as well as combined with the long list of to-dos that Kai mentioned right at the beginning in the slide. So I'm really concerned about the feasibility of the task force to address all of this for the June turnaround. And I appreciate your comment, Tom, that, you know, we'll get there when we get there, as it were. But in addressing the enthusiasm of our stakeholders, perhaps what we need to do is push a publication a little bit later, but I don't know if that's necessarily going to get us where we want to either. I don't think another quarter is going to help us here. So perhaps alternative, what we should consider instead is actually issuing a document, not as an ED, but I believe Kai actually mentioned this too, but in a similar manner to an ITC that we developed for QM. So it's a discussion paper. And we have this, if you like, standard in the background, and this will allow us to really focus on exactly what type of entities our stakeholders were envisaging, it's not an easy word this late at night, sorry, exactly what they were thinking of at the time that they were putting forward the request, and the reality of the problems when applying the requirements to those entities, with the standard used as a reference or context in making those points. And also, I think this paper could reflect the realities of the conundrum we are facing, and also seek some direct feedback as well from policymakers as to whether such a standard is feasible in their jurisdiction or in their markets. And other parties, of course, who have interest in such companies, and that means lenders, credit reference agencies, and so forth. And it could also address the importance of the application material and explain why that's really important to the requirements, and what level of knowledge the practitioner is supposed to have when they start using this standard, and what is right when they start using this standard. And I don't think that will push out a final standard much further, because we have a really good starting point, or we will have a really good starting point for an ED that can be refined. And I am a little bit worried about multiple re-exposures, which our predecessors have faced in the past, and it's not a very comfortable place to be. But at the end of the day, this is about audit quality and making sure we uphold the robustness of our audit. And unless we really understand what we're scoping in here, I think that's really going to be a struggle for us, even to June or even to September. So apologies that I sort of went into the professional judgment piece again, but those were the three areas on my opening remarks. But again, I do want to say thank you so much for that hard work. I can see it's been a tremendous amount of work, and I really do appreciate it.
Okay. We have still 7 hands up, so I'm slowly going through the order. And I also want us to ask ourselves, to consider ourselves, as you raised a question about re-exposures or multiple re-exposures, why that necessarily is bad. Our due process clearly allows us to have limited re-exposures, but I think all of these things are up for discussion. So I'm not rejecting it, but in a way where we're changing the standard setting model, we should assess whether our existing operating assumptions are necessarily right, particularly in this unique instance. Edda.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Yeah, Kai Morton, task force staff, indeed incredible effort. you've definitely occupied my evenings to get through the material, and I've worked through most of it. So I want to express my great appreciation for all the hard work done. Unfortunately, I don't feel myself getting more comfortable since the December meeting, and I'm also approaching this, like Josephine, from the audit quality lens. In my mind, over the last years, there's been a number of ISAs issued that have become lengthier for a reason, and that is to enable them to deliver audit quality consistently. Somewhere in my mind, I struggle to reconcile that a standard that leaves all of that out or rephrases some of the requirements that have been carefully thought over as they were put in place, how that achieves the same level of quality in a consistent manner. However, having said that, that may be appropriate. And if we understand the scope better, and let me explain that a little bit better, because I've gone also to, and have not completed it, but I have gone through the mapping documents, and if the scope is narrower, I can understand judgments made by the task force where they say that this is still, we've rephrased it, modifications have been made that are more appropriate for the ISA for LCE. And that would be okay if I can have an appreciation of what that then actually is. But where my concern sits is and similar, I guess, to Josephine, is in that scoping. We, in my outreach, I understand that there are stakeholders that are pushing for more rather than less entities to be in scope. And that could, and also the way it's currently phrased, with some of the complex modeling, Josephine mentioned black skulls, but similarly, a binomial or a Monte Carlo simulation, those are very complex. And then if those are allowed to be in scope, then I need to reconsider the type of entity and the requirements, how that has reformulated, and the context of missing the application guidance. The intent was that this standard stands on its own and that the practitioner reads this and is able to deliver consistent quality. For the potentially very large private clients that could be in scope, and particularly with also a push for group audits to be in scope of the standards, I really struggle to understand that that quality can be delivered consistently by the practitioners by merely looking the standards. I think that the practitioners need to have a good and full understanding of the full ISAs, to enable them to deliver this in a consistent manner. And as a result, I also am doubtful about the usefulness and the willingness of standard setters to adopt this in their jurisdiction. I'm hearing doubt from more than one jurisdiction. If I apply this to the Netherlands, one of the previous IFIAR chairs, Janine van Diffelen, has, on the request of the Dutch Institute, performed a strategic exploration into the Netherlands standard setting process. And in her outreach, she found that there's a desire for differentiation of audit procedures as applicable and guidance rather than a different standard. Consequently, from a Dutch perspective, it is questionable whether the standard would actually be used. So if I stand back, I'm wondering whether the draft LCE standard tries to accommodate too many stakeholders. And as a result, there's a risk that this may be a standard that either not be used or not liked on the basis of the quality considerations for the potentially larger entities where we could face quality issues, or for the audits of very simple entities where the practitioners may feel that this standard is still too onerous. So I'm with Josephine and Kai Uwe on going back to probably more a discussion paper or a means to allow for specific targeted questions that we need to bottom out before we decide on exposing it. So those were my overall comments. I'm in the camp with most of our commenters about the 3-year period. So I struggle with that. I'm also not convinced on the name. I think we can do something different, and I haven't thought through all the consequences yet. But that's sort of where I am. Sorry for the long intro, Tom. My overall comments, and notwithstanding my great appreciation for the task force and staff for a monumental amount of work. Thank you.
Okay, so for those who have some concerns, I see some consistent themes. Some of it emerges from what they believe is the risk of having too broad of a scope or applicability, even though we'll get to that section in more detail, but that flows through in terms of general ability to get their hands around it. There's some questions about what the right next due process stage is, and we could have some discussion about what we call it or not. I think there's some symbolic value in that, but we could have a discussion about that, but I'll park that issue. We also have a number of concerns about the maintenance, and the great majority just thinks that 3 years, the way it's proposed, is too infrequent. And I know why the IFRS for SMEs did it, was to avoid this constant shifting platform, but audit's different than financial reporting. Some comments on the blue boxes, which I sort of think are things that could be addressed. But I'm just trying to, in addition to those who are broadly supportive, I just want to sort of continue to gather the list of the issues of concern as well, in addition to just the ability to digest the material too. Okay, Kai, Morten, is that your read of the list right now? Yeah. Okay. I'm not passing judgment on any of that, so I'm not. I just want to make sure we're picking these things up as we go. Diane.
Well, I have the fortunate chance to go after a nice summary, Tom. So, first of all, Kai, Morten, I really appreciate all the hard work that you all put through, and when I opened up the mapping schedule, I thought, oh boy. First of all, I was like, thank you very much for doing it. And then as it opened and the pages kept loading, I started to think, I'm not so sure I really wanted this, but it was quite helpful. So maybe a couple overarching comments. Number one, Ado mentioned this, and I think, Tom, maybe just something to keep on the to-do list is this jurisdictional application. I think this is not per se in the standard, but I do think one of the things we need to noodle on and think about is if a country has developed its own standard, and then this one, ours comes out, the IAASB standard comes out, is there going to be guidance as to what the practitioner should use, must use, what judgment is involved? And so I think some of the application considerations will need to be out there, because I think the auditors are going to need some clarification on how to proceed. My second general comment is similar to Kai Uwe's comment and Josephine's comment. And I look at this through the eyes of really focusing on audit quality and also focusing on the stakeholders, the users of these financial statements, the users of this audit opinion. And I absolutely understand the importance of this subject. And I absolutely understand in many jurisdictions and regions, this is a significant population of the audit. So I want to underscore that. Where I started to get a little confused was the mapping, because when I went through the mapping and I really tried to focus on the elements of the ICEs that maybe did not come over into the standard. And as I went through each of those, I evaluated them and said, okay, maybe I understand that. Maybe I can appreciate why that didn't carry over. But I do think one good exercise would be some sort of aggregation. I did not aggregate all the bits and pieces that did not come over. And so I didn't have the ability to take a step back and say everything that did not come over into the standard, what do I think of that in the aggregate? And the reason that becomes important is at the end of the day, it is an audit. And I think we do need to challenge ourselves to make sure that the extent of work ultimately results in an audit opinion. And that is extremely important for quality. It's extremely important for the users of these financial statements who are going to take that audit opinion and maybe give it to the bank or give it to shareholders. And so I do want to just pause and make sure that we're comfortable that the level of work and the effort is still commensurate with the definition of an audit. So those are kind of my overarching comments. I also would also just echo some of Josephine's comments about the scope. I thought I understood the scope, but as I read through it, and sometimes there were examples provided, it seemed to imply the examples to me were indications of a more complex entity. And whether it be some of the discussion about an audit committee, there were some discussions about IT systems, it started to cause me again to take a step back and say, we need to be really careful, even with some of the examples and language that's in here, that we're not sending mixed messages that could create confusion for the practitioner as to what is in scope and whether this can be applied. And then finally, relative to some of the comments in the preface, I like the symbols, although I have a bit of a question as to how we landed on professional skepticism and documentation. To me, if you're going to call out where you think professional skepticism should occur, it sends an implied message that you don't think professional skepticism needs to occur in the other places. And sometimes, again, as I think about the poor practitioner who's out there trying to execute these audits, they may say, okay, on this step, I don't need to exercise professional skepticism. And I would hate to give a mixed message. I think an auditor should be skeptical. An auditor should always question. And that will come in different courses of the audit execution. I thought it was interesting that we didn't call out where the executive or the partner in charge or whatever the lead executives of the engagement is should be involved. There's some discussion later on about reviewing work papers, and there's a comment in there that the partner doesn't always have to review every work paper. But if it's a small job, it might only be the partner and a staff person. So I think this whole concept about what we're calling out, and maybe more importantly, what we're not calling out, is something we just need to think about so we don't send unintended messages or have unintended consequences. And then I agree with the comments about the 3-year maintenance, that we don't want to wait 3 years. If something is developing, we should make conforming amendments and so on. So those are my comments, Tom. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Kai Morton and your team.
Thank you, Diane. Again, sort of, it's nice that we're having some consistency and theme as well. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And I think I'm continuing the theme. I mean, amazing amount of work that's gone into getting the material to the board for this meeting. I just can't imagine how many hours must have gone into that. Really impressive. And I've always said to my stakeholders who, even before this project really got going, struggled with the concept of a separate standard, and I said, let's wait until we actually see it, and then we can kick it around and see whether it works for us or not. And I've got to say, in the outreach that I've been doing in Canada on this, a lot of the same concerns that have been raised by Edo and Josephine and others have come up, and it really does go to audit quality and what the impact of this will be on audit quality, and also the expectation gap. You know, we've talked about whether it should be referred to as an ISA or, you know, an ISA for LCEs, and making the report different from what an ISA report looks like. But there's a lot of concern about the impact on the expectation gap. To Diane's point that she just mentioned, a lot of us were really struggling with the question of what is the difference between this audit and an ISA audit? What really, at the bottom line, is the difference? And that was not clear. And I think that goes partly to the applicability concern. If you're not sure what's in the standard in the first place, it's hard to know what the work effort needs to be at the other end. And because we were so unclear about that, it really made us question whether the applicability was too broad. And the whole transition question is a big one. I mean, all of these small entities are going through COVID right now. What would happen to them if we had the separate standard in this situation this year? Would they all be flipped over to become ISA audits? You know, it just wouldn't make sense. So it just, the relationship of this standard with the ISAs and how you transition to the ISAs is really an inhibitor. And so at the end of the day, I think, you know, we're really asking ourselves, will this standard meet the needs of whoever is being asked, who is asking for this standard? And will it still enable audit quality? And sort of looking at the applicability in relation to the lack of application material to support the requirements is also, you know, where we think there could be some audit quality challenges. So I'm afraid, you know, I'm open-minded to sort of working towards a separate standard, but just right now, it's just, there's too many challenges to just getting the concept buttoned down from my point of view. I'm not sure what the right next steps should be, but I think I'm aligned with some of the other comments that have come out tonight. Thank you.
I have to say, we sort of have a split of views here as it's emerging too. It's not unanimous, but we are hearing sort of, we had a string of people with one set of views, and now we're having the concerns. Not to say that we don't have to address the concerns. The scope one's a big one. Part of me asked the question is, how do we know what users will want without asking them? And this is something that, if I look around this board, that's partly why we've set up the reference group, and partly why we consult the SMPAG and others throughout this process, is to get it. But I think that is also part of the logic as it relates to quicker user testing through some type of form of consultation, whatever that may be. We also recognize that this may not be the standard for all jurisdictions. So that's also a reality, because I see like there seems to be some division on this point as well that existed before the study. As you remember, we had a number of respondents saying that they wanted a separate standard. Some people just wanted guidance. Some people wanted or the sort of the building block approach. So it's not surprising the diversity of views. all that should be in the name of audit quality. So I'm not sacrificing that point at all. And so issues of applicability and proportionality, which Josephine has reminded us throughout, is big. Let's finish this round and then we'll break. Sue and then Wendy.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Kai. I mean, huge amount of work, and this has definitely moved on. From my perspective, I mean, this is such an important project. I think it's important that we get something out to get feedback from people who are going to be using this. Perhaps with just one caveat, and that's around groups. And I know we'll come back to that on the scope piece, but I think that's the area that could hamper the uptake of this. And one of the concerns is actually whether, if groups are completely excluded in an exposure draft that goes out soon, whether the potential is to lose some of the good work that has been done because of potentially having to need to re-expose at a later point. So I know we'll come back to that later, but I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. I'm trying to pull out the points that are slightly different to what's come up already. On the mapping, we have some comments which we'll send through, obviously, a few inconsistencies and things. I wondered whether, given clearly the amount of work that's gone into this, the number of comments that you're going to have coming back, and the point that Diane made about needing to do a standback, whether there's an opportunity or something to perhaps get a group that hasn't been involved so far, just one or two people, to do almost like an audit of some of these principles or something like that, because I think that may then help with some of the concerns that, you know, perhaps Kai, Uwe and others have raised. There's a huge amount there. It's a great piece of work, but we probably need to be clear that that's all been buttoned down really well. The maintenance point, I've had similar comments around the length of time, and you know, 3 years plus 18 months being a long period, including a question about whether it's right to have reasonable assurance under what would be two quite different sets of standards potentially. But that said, I did reach out to people that use the IFRS for SMEs and talk through the stable platform piece there. And there's definitely something about being able to learn from the implementation in part of the community and then take that and build that in. So maybe the timeline isn't quite right, but that stability in that smaller piece, smaller market, does seem to be attractive. And then a couple of pieces, the symbols, I think, seem to fall down sometimes into personal taste. You know, some people related to them, some didn't. And then the blue boxes with EEMs, I found in some places, and this is a personal view, I just sort of found in some places the blue box was almost detracting from the text that was unhighlighted, which is the requirements. And I just think maybe there's a step back there sometimes to see, have we given so much prominence to something that isn't the thing that is driving what you absolutely have to do? So I think that's it from me on the high level stuff, but really appreciate the works that have been done.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Wendy?
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'm incredibly impressed with the unprecedented work done by Kai Morton and his group to address the needs for simplification of the auditing standards for less complex entities. And then I also like the fact that you said that there's still some work to do. And I personally don't, you know, I agree with a lot of the things that were said. You could probably see me nodding my head about timing and scope. I'm not sure it matters whether it's an exposure draft or or a discussion paper in June. I think we just need to focus on some high priorities before we get that out. And one of them for me is definitely scope. I'm not clear on the population that will end up in the scope at all. And then I'm concerned that jurisdictions will play with that even further. So we'll have huge inconsistency country to country, which then takes me back to group audits. And I'm not necessarily wanting group audits in the scope, but I'm thinking about me doing a group audit where I have to think about the entire world that is reporting into me. And, you know, maybe it's small entities in different countries and not in other countries. And I need to reconcile back to my standard in every case. So I don't have an answer for that. I just wanted to express that was one of my concerns and something that Fernando had touched on in terms of how this impacts the component work. Some other points that I will reflect on: the mapping documents, which everybody has talked about, tremendous effort. Kudos to those who put that together. But I did find myself getting stuck in the details. I had to walk away from it a few times. And I think something that would bring together the significant differences. There used to be something called Cliff Notes. That's not exactly what I'm talking about, but an executive summary of what the significant differences are, what's in and what's out would help me a lot. For the name and the separate, I've struggled with this quite a bit. I see arguments on both sides. I don't quite understand what standalone means. I favor it being very closely aligned with the other standards from a quality perspective, and that is really more about perception than maybe reality over time. But I think the ISAs stand for a very high level of quality, and I'll skip to the end a little bit. I'm a little concerned if the report looks different and it's a whole separate standalone by itself with a different name, you know, like ISA Lite 1, that it's hard to have stakeholders understand reasonable assurance is the same reasonable assurance that you're getting with the rest of the ISAs. And then I will just, transitioning back and forth, I think everybody touched on already, that was a concern of mine. And then I'll quickly go on the preface or the symbols. I like the documentation symbol. I'm hoping that could possibly end up as being another appendix for all the things that need documentation all in one place. And then the professional skepticism one I don't like, because it sort of implies I need to only apply professional skepticism in certain cases. So those are my thoughts on the symbols. The maintenance I thought was way too long, but also tied back into the quality piece of the basic ISAs. Why would we not update or do conforming changes with this standard, regardless of where it sits? And I think that's all I'm gonna add for now.
Thank you. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. And I have two overall comments. It actually relates to mapping documents, but it really relates to how to move forward this project, and also a bit relevant to others' comments. So I would like to read them right now. And first thing is that I also think the mapping documents are very, very important to analyze and understand the draft. And I really appreciate Task Force's hard work to prepare such a document. But when I read through them, I found the comparison column is particularly very difficult to understand, because there are a lot of yes responses in the comparison column. I'm a bit concerned that the readers of the mapping documents have difficulty in identifying differences between these two standards, and make misunderstanding that the differences is very limited. For example, some of the first question in the comparison column say yes, but the draft ISA for LCE doesn't have corresponding requirement because of the reason mentioned there. Also, first question on the sum comparison column says yes, and the second question says yes, modification have been made, blah, blah, blah. And when I compared the requirements, it was not easy to identify which parts of either requirement were modified. And I found this type of exclamation were made across the mapping documents. I agree with the direction of comparing these two standards by preparing this. I think it's very important. In order to enhance the current version for people to digest, for example, I want to suggest highlighting the parts that are not included in the ISA for LCE. And second comment is perhaps it is a bit similar to what Wendy said about executive summary. I understand mapping documents are beneficial to identify anything missing or different by comparing two documents, but I think it is the case even when the upcoming exposure draft is consulted also, because either for LCE also need to provide reasonable assurance. I think the respondents are very, very interested in how it can be achieved with the different structures from ISA, full ISA. But the mapping documents are so huge. So I'm concerned that stakeholders, particularly those other than auditors, will not be able to read all the content one by one with sufficient resources. So I want to suggest that more condensed document that explain the difference in very simple manner should also be prepared and attached to the exposure draft or consultation document, because I believe it is very important from the IAASB strategic perspective to explain to the public that standard for LC facilitate really the performance of high quality audit and serve for public interest. So I think more condensed and easy to follow document is absolutely necessary for this purpose. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant Coe. Just my memory serves me. The purpose of this mapping document was at a request after the last meeting to try to show the linkages between the two. What we do with it in the future, I think, is up for grabs, Sergio, and and how it exists. But I think Josephine's also made a point how linking it to this applicability and scoping issue is a big point on this, is what the logic is and what the proportionality is. But it was precisely for that reason that the staff created this. And I know it took an enormous amount of work to get the mapping document to the state that it was in. Imran.
Thank you and good evening. Tom, I wanted to say that in anticipation of this evening's discussion, we saw tweets coming out of the IAASB about this. And to those who haven't seen the tweets, really congratulations to the staff and the team who are behind it about creating excitement and interest online about what it is that we're discussing. I think it's a reflection of the very significant topics that we're dealing with here, that we're sharing it in this way with the world. So you want to just acknowledge that in the open session. Tom, I think that in some respects, our board is united on one matter, and that matter is that the team has done an enormous amount of work. Everyone who's spoken is confidently behind that assertion. And I think, like to revert to Kai Morton's metaphor of the mountain, he has had a fantastic group of co-climbers. And of course, he has had two brave Sherpas, or more than that, in Bev and Nikki, working with him up this hill. And indeed, they've been brave to bring all of this to us. But what we know, Tom, is that climbing a mountain sometimes one runs into wind or rain or snow. And when those things happen, we slow down, we regroup, we catch our breath, or we just, and then we get ready to move forward again. And maybe that's a little bit of what we're witnessing in today's conversation. Kai's pathway up the mountain wasn't described as a straight line. And amongst the many people who've spoken today, certainly we've seen some pockets of support, but we've also seen some pockets of what I would describe at the moment as being not fatal, but rather fundamental issues that need to be talked about. But that said, I can only imagine the last 3 months must have been real hell for everybody who worked so hard on this. So really, really, really grateful for that. What I have done in anticipation of this meeting is I've sent very detailed comments on the entire document. I it was really the highlight of the last fortnight, being able to read it cover to cover. It's created so much of excitement. But Tom, what I recognize from the number of people I shared it with is that many people haven't been able to process the implications of it. So how is this different to an ISA audit? What's been left out? What's been included? And like others have said, they need time to process that, and also understanding that what we have is a work in progress. And because it's brand new, the reference group we have here is actually 18 board members. Other than those in the task force, everybody's reading it for the first time. So we're really getting, original reactions to this. I doubt that we'll get many more reactions that are different to this because, we're all approaching it for the very first time. So what I would like to pick up on then is just some specifics, and I'm going to limit it to the preface of this document. In doing so, I want to associate myself particularly with the comments that Kai, Uwe, Ido, Josephine, Diane, Eric, and to some extent Sue made. There really is much that I would call challenges or fundamental matters. It's too early in the process to call them fatal, but they certainly need to be worked through. And it takes time to work through those things, and indeed a lot of discussion in the board. And I think one of those matters, Tom, is really this interplay between where we as a board split these projects. We split these projects into two streams. We said that work is going to happen on the CUSP stream and work's going to happen here. And we said that the drafting conventions out of the CUSP stream are going to migrate here. Now, until we've worked that out, I can't see how we can reconcile the two yet. Until we've worked out what those CUSP conventions are going to be, what does this drafting represent? Because at a minimum, it means that whatever filters or stylistic issues are going to come out of CUSP that we as the board have to agree to, then have to be worked through this entire standard afresh. As I understand the original fork that we created. And so, one of the reasons why a pause at this base camp may be necessary, it may be necessary for CUSP to catch up so that they can be matched. So we don't end up with an extensive rewrite at some later stage. That said, I think there are some principles that we need to work out. And the first of these principles is this reliance on a support guide. The support guide is a new concept for us, that one that lives alongside a standard. And the issues paper mentions it several times, almost as in, we don't have space in the standard, let's put it in the support guide. And I think that as a board, we're going to have to need a much clearer principled approach to what belongs in the standard because it has these characteristics, and what therefore doesn't meet these requirements and can sit in the support guide. And by the same token, we need another set of rules around what belongs in the ISAs and not within this standard. It is easy to second guess the task force to say, but why didn't you bring that in? Or why didn't you leave this out? And we can only second guess them because we haven't agreed on principles. If we agree on some principle that you don't have to bring in all of those examples from the reporting standards, then all we'll be doing is applying those principles consistently across this standard. So I think we need a principle about therefore what goes into and out of this the support guide, and certainly what we take and replicate from the ISAs and which ones we don't. Coming then to the preface, there is this notion, and this is one of those fundamental points, Tom, about the fact that this standard, and I'm using the word this standard because I recognize there's a brewing discussion about the name. We say it is based on, and I think that there's a lot that rides on this choice of words, the based on argument. And I'm not sure that as a board we've settled what that clarification means. And whether after clarifying that we can give it may give rise to some adjustments. And I'll give some examples of that just now. I wondered what then happens to all of those considerations for small entities that exist in the ISAs. And whether they are more detailed or less detailed than what we have here, and whether we will do a case-by-case review of them to be able to reconcile them and decide what gets deleted and what gets brought across. I was just uncertain how that was all still going to work. I think I did something that only an accountant with too much of time would do. I counted up all the requirements with a pen in my hand. I numbered them all one by one. If you do a simple search on the PDF of the word shell, you end up with a number of about 290 requirements. However, you can exclude those that sit within the preface and the applicability paragraph. You may end up with 270 requirements. But there's a neat trick, and the trick is that there are a large number of requirements that only have a shell in the introduction line, and they're followed by bulleted list. And really, I think it's a necessary exercise, only because we have to answer that question: what's the difference between this standard and the ISAs, to know what that number adds up to. A particularly hardworking AICPA technical advisor on our board a few years back told us that they'd counted the requirements in the ISAs that were that existed then, and it was a number of 540. And I haven't worked out yet what that means. What does 290 versus 540 mean? And what does the gap represent in relation to this is the work effort that's missing, but you can still get to fair present, you can still get to this audit opinion. So I'm sorry to weigh it up in, well, I'm not sorry to weigh it up that way. I'm trying to ways to understand this. And that was one way of weighing this thing up. In respect of the icons, I think that a very discriminating read of this standard will show us the inconsistent usage of it, because there should be many more places where the professional skepticism icon appears, and certainly many more places where the documentation icon appears. And so it seems to be subjective at the moment, and it could be littered in many more places, which I think then would make it totally redundant, because you'd have to have it in so many places. So many procedures have elements of professional skepticism in them, or have to be documented. And so I think that while this was well-meaning, I think in time we'll recognize that it's going to be hard to engineer throughout the standard. Also, because the documentation icons, we also have paragraph headings with documentation in it. And so it's hard to reconcile when we use documentation as a heading and when we use the pen as the icon for the same thing. I share the comments about the frequency of the updates if that was necessary. And then there is this thing which is linked to whether it's based on the ISAs or not. The idea that we say in paragraph P13 that the ISA for LCE is a standalone document. And I'm not convinced that that statement is true, because there are sections that exist outside of this document. And it can't be operationalized without that stuff. And so I put it there because I think we're these words have used in other contexts, used in a disciplinary hearing, may have very dire consequences for the parties involved. I think for the moment I'm just describing the way I read them and how I'm interpreting those issues. So those are my comments. I want to end this bit with just another mountaining metaphor. Muhammad Ali said, "It's not the mountain ahead that wears you out; it's the pebble in your shoes." And I think what we have today is really just a few stones in our shoes that we're going to have to take the boot out, get these stones out, and then continue the hike. And hopefully we'll all summit together one day. Thank you.
I'm still relatively new to this board, but it's not surprising that when you read a draft standard that we're going to have disagreements about the content of the draft standard. That is neither a reflection of whether we're going to get to a common destination or not, notwithstanding that there are serious substantive issues to address. The biggest one in my mind that I'm hearing relates to applicability and scope, because it has the knock-on consequences in terms of whether the requirements are sufficiently robust to produce a quality audit. I think that, to me, seems to be a lot at the core of the fundamental issues that have been raised today. And we are going to get to the applicability section or not. It also, I guess, to me, the fact that we have different requirements in and of itself should not necessarily mean you can't get to a reasonable assurance opinion. For certain, and as I said, I'm not a professional auditor, we get reasonable assurance opinions signed off under multiple standards throughout the world that are different, included in the jurisdiction that I sit in for publicly traded companies, for listed companies, and in those who use ISAs, right? So I guess my point is the sheer difference in requirements in and of itself does not necessarily mean that you're not getting a high quality audit, that it leads you to a reasonable assurance opinion. So I think it's important for us to go to root causes of where the concerns are. And I'm honing in on, I guess Josephine was the first to articulate this, maybe Ada was. And that seems like the biggest fundamental issue that people are grappling with, notwithstanding that there are other points that are getting made. And it's appropriate that we're getting to applicability next. Vili, I know you wanted to comment.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for all of the good input. I think just a few perspectives in terms of how we take this forward as a board, because I think that's one of the big things we've been grappling with this project. Remember, we've started this work back in 2017. I think Isabel referred to the first meeting that was held around this. Since then, we've done an enormous amount of outreach. We've had a discussion paper. The need for this standard was confirmed. In the context also of IAASB, please help us at the global level because there's a risk of divergence. Please, you need to look at your mandate as a global standard setter for all types of entities. We proceeded to prepare a project proposal. That project proposal was approved in December, which clearly signaled this board's intent to do this project and that this project was indeed possible. I do think, I think Tom was quite right in summarizing that it sounds like the scope or applicability section is a big part of this. And I think, I've been reflecting on this because a few things were also mentioned in the comments that I think, in essence, we know what we're trying to do here. We're trying to design a standard where we are saying there are certain entities where you can do an audit and you can do a quality audit and you can express a reasonable assurance opinion where you do not need all of the ISAs with all of the application material to go through the whole filtering process of making decisions at various points where you, because of the characteristics of the entity, a partner can pick up a trial balance, he looks through the trial balance, he immediately knows where the risks are, he immediately knows what work to do, and he will get to a good opinion. So it's a question of, we are trying to draw a line in the sand of when is this enough and when is this not enough. There are certain entities clearly through various developments in a number of jurisdictions around the world where this is possible, where you can say, well, you don't have to have the entire text of all the ISAs. You are able to just use this. It's enough for you in the circumstances to get to a reasonable assurance opinion. It's never about doing less work. It is about doing the right work and only doing the work that is necessary to be persuaded that audit risk has been reduced to an acceptable low level in the circumstances of the engagement. It's never audit light. It's a proper audit for the circumstances of that audit. So we must please never try and, or stay away from this notion of audit light. It's not a sub-quality audit. Like I said, it's not about doing less work. It's about doing the right work. And maybe part of the answer lies in to say, well, if we have this clear objective in mind, that it is possible to do this, then it is almost asking the other way around, for which circumstances is what we have in the standard, for which circumstances is this appropriately proportionate? And I think that is why the scope thing might be coming up all the time. Look, whatever we call this in the end, I think we've reached a juncture where we are not going to take this forward unless we give people the requirements and the standards and say, listen, this is the set of requirements that we want to take forward to achieve reasonable assurance for, yes, rightly so, we need to debate that for those entities for which it will be appropriately proportionate. Whatever we're going to call it and whatever we need to take out, we've reached a juncture where fairly soon we need to get the stakeholders' views on this. And not just the auditors that are going to use it, regulators that are overseeing those auditors, users of those financial statements. We need to get that broad input. We've put in a lot of work in putting this draft standard together. So whatever goes out can't just be a consultation on asking questions again. There's an optics issue here as well. The stakeholders are going to ask us, but we told you last year what we thought. We told you last year that this is what we need. We need to give them something in the form of a standard or very, very close to a standard for us, so that we can get that feedback and those comments, because I fear we're not going to be able to take this forward if we don't put that in stakeholders' hands. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Philly. One more comment, and then I'll turn it back to Kai, and then we'll break. And Kai, maybe you even want to just say something quickly, and then you could think about the comments over the break and return to that. Carl.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for giving me the floor. I just wanted to come in here after having listened to all the comments, and I must say I've had these debates about proportionality in many different contexts. This is probably the most difficult discussion which a regulator or a standard setter can have. Because what you're doing, you have standards, and what you're trying to achieve now is a top-down approach, whilst the logic would say you need to follow a bottom-up approach. And to admit that something can be of equal quality, although it's not applying all the requirements, that is a very difficult acceptance as a standard setter or a regulator. And that's why these debates on proportionality are very difficult. And that's why I very strongly support, in the public interest, the need to develop a document that to come out soon to consult, as Willie said, the stakeholders. Stakeholders will see what you have done. They will help you. They will assist you in your final decision. And the longer you postpone that, the more difficult it will be to agree between yourselves on what you want to expose. Because let there be no misunderstanding, when the PIOB is strongly in favor of such a standard, it is not because we want these audits not to be of high quality, because to develop some document which you then call an audit and which would not be of high quality would not be in the public interest. And that is something which I think this document should also contain, in the preface, a clear message of what the objective of these exercises. The objective is, by applying these requirements, we should achieve a high quality audit, because that is in the public interest. So basically, I think a lot of work has gone into this. A number of issues need to be resolved. Scope is crucial. You need to find the right population to which this will be applied. But then you will have to accept that what you produce is actually also leading to an audit of high quality in the public interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. I mean, now, there are fundamental issues for discussion here, but part of me says that we're sort of crossing the bridge before we get to it and making assertions about whether we could do something by June or not, and in what form. And that's a legitimate debate, but not really should be driving the discussion today. I just don't know how we can make a determination about getting something out in June today, when we do have some substantive issues to go, and we may or may not be able to resolve that to the board's contentment to get enough votes to get it out, but also recognize there's some urgency. One thing I do know is if we don't set June as a target and set some other date as a target or relax it, we won't get June as a target, and we'll be disappointing a lot of people. So I guess for the rest of the discussion, it was a really robust day. It set parameters about what expectations and the strength of view up front, and the realities of us getting to something that would be acceptable to get board vote out. And we heard views on all sides of the urgency on this. But I guess the rest of the discussion, let's focus it on the issues on hand and say that we realize it, and don't prejudge the task force's ability to achieve the desirable outcome. And then we could make a judgment about June as we get closer to June, but also recognize if we don't hit it, there are expectations that will not be achieved by others, just like we make with all other calls on timelines for this board. Does that seem like a reasonable place to go? Because I feel like part of it is that people are so looking at the finish line that it's sort of polluting the discussion, and there's a risk that we won't get to the bottom of the key issues of concern. I don't know, Kai, if you feel the same way.
Yeah, Tom, and thanks to all the board members that expressed their view. I think we knew from the very beginning that it would be a difficult project. I think when we had the discussions earlier as well, we didn't have an anonymous view and agreement on where to go. So we know that there are a difference of opinion on where to go. And I recognize some of them being raised here and around, as you perfectly summarized, it seems like it's around the scoping and applicability that drives some of this, the feedback that we got there. We did get some other specific feedback as well. But I do think, as Willie also summarized, that the only way we can get good and constructive feedback is to that we expose something that look like a standard, so they can actually see which kind of requirements we are suggesting, and then they can make a judgment to see which entities should this standard be allowed to be used for. And also recognizing that in the standard, what we can do internationally is to give a frame of the applicability and scope, and it's up to the national jurisdictions to further develop that and to say if it should be able to use in their jurisdiction or not. So I think that's on the general comments, and then to the specific comments that we received on the preface, the 3-year period we did adopt from IFRS for SME. I can clearly see that there was really not too much appetite for that in the board, so we can look at that as well. I think we outlined in the beginning, we will look at the transition from the separate standard to the ISA, so that's up to that we will do. Also some good feedback on the blue boxes, difference of opinion on the symbols. We'll take that with us going forward. And on the mapping, I think it's important not only to judge the mapping or the separate standard based on what's not in there. It should be based on reading the standard and then making judgment to see if we reach reasonable assurance or not. Because if we do it the other way around, we're automatically saying that all of what's in the ISAs should be there, and then that's a different starting point than what we what we have in our project proposal. So it should be judged on the requirements necessary to reach reasonable assurance for the less complex entities when we agree on that, on what that is. Yeah, I think that was some of the general comments that we got. So Tom, probably more than overdue for a break.
I think that is something we will get unanimous consent on. There'll be no objection to a break right now, unless you guys want to discuss that too. We'll take a 10-minute break right now. It's 6 minutes after the hour. We'll reconvene at 16 minutes. I think probably the realistic element is that scope and applicability will take some time. If you've made comments on scope and applicability, please hold off on raising your hand to let others people talk about that issue next, right? Kai, do you think that's a reasonable place to go? Okay, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you all. Okay. Could people get their cameras back on? Okay, Kai, I have two hands that are up right now. Do you mind if I go to them first? Three hands now. We haven't started the applicability section, so if it's related to applicability, if it's a response to the conclusion of the last session, then your hands could be up, or if it's for applicability, then I'll get to you in that section. Yosh, do you have a general comment you want to make?
No, just a applicability comment.
Okay, we'll get to you. Let Kai set that up. Imran and Sachiko, you can put your hands up. So your space in the queue will be reserved. Sorry. We have Imran, Yosh, Sachiko first for the next round. But Kai, why don't you begin?
Sure, thanks. Michelle, could you put up the slide that we have for the applicability? Yeah, I think while Michelle puts up that slide, there it is. Yeah. You can see as you've seen from the papers, the applicability section has been reworked from December. In September, we had described the attributes of a less complex, or what could you consist of less complex by dividing them into the entity characteristics of the entity, and then also based on the applicable financial reporting. We got the feedback that was complex and confusing, so we've gone back and done it differently, not focusing on that. And as you've seen, that we've now put the characteristics in a different grouping. But before we go there, the applicability really has two parts. One is the prescriptive part, where we scope out where law or regulation prohibit the use of the standard. Then we also scope out listed entities. I think as I described earlier, we are though following the IAASB project to public interest entities. We had a discussion also with IAASB on the public accountability, and if we could use something similar on the applicability of our standard. On balance, though, our decision, we fell down at introducing a new area and a new definition that is not consistently applied around the world would be more confusing. So we decided to stay at listed entities for now. But we will follow that, and I think also we follow the scoping out the group audit. So you have the excluded part, remembering also then that the individual jurisdictions can add to this to scope out even more entities. That's in the preface now. And then you come to the judgment areas, where we grouped the characteristics of when an entity would be considered to be more complex based on business activities and governance structure, the use of information system, and what we have called basic accounting estimates. That is similar concept to what IFRS for SME has used in their standard around basic financial instruments. These are all just to draw the line of where what kind of entities should be scoped in. Around basic accounting estimates, we've in the appendix included examples of where they could be scoped in or out. So we're looking for feedback for that as well. And the judgment, I think already from discussion we had, there are different views around the amount of judgment and level of judgment that should be used. I think on balance, there always will be some judgment on the use of the standard. And what we've developed here is not to be seen as a checklist to but there are characteristics that you need to consider in individually and in combination, and you will make the judgment to see if the standard is applicable to use or not. That is a significant judgment, and in the standard there is a documentation requirement that you need to document the judgment you use to reach a conclusion to use the standard, and then there is a standback requirement that you need to look at that again after you obtain your understanding. In the draft you have, it's in part 5. It's in the wrong part. It should have been in part 6, so it's placed in the wrong place, but the standback requirement is there at the end of part 5. It should have been in part 6. I think by that we should then open for comments on the applicability. I think when we get the comments, we need to focus, or I hope that we can focus them on how we can progress this and how we can make it more specific, and so we get some more direction on where to go from here. Thank you. By that, I think go back to you, Tom, for comments on the applicability.
I assume we're going to get no comments on this section, Kai. We
Yeah,
just move on to the next, right?
Yep.
Imran, I promised you, you're first.
Well, as you said, Tom, no comments. Let's move on. I have a residual comment first to start with, and this relates to what the standard is based on. I did indicate that the argument of using it being based on needs to be clarified because it gives rise to certain issues. And the question is, does it stand alone, or does it need the ISAs? I want to make the point that this is not merely a drafting issue, but it is a rather significant regulatory issue. And there are many regulatory issues that arise from this, but let me give you this one example, Kai, that if some inspector, an external inspector, picks up a file, wishes to make a finding, and he quotes the ISAs to support a finding on an ISA for less complex entity audit. And he says in his finding that his finding is that because it is based on the ISAs, he's using the ISAs to justify his findings. Would that inspector be right? So if this standard does not include all the reporting aspects, by way of an example, then it does not stand alone, but it also creates the challenge of understanding then which versions of the ISAs is it going to be attached to if this standard is not revised at the same time. So moving on to the applicability section, Kai, I'll say to you that to sort out applicability of the EQR standard on ISQM took us 2 years. So don't worry if you get a little bit of feedback here. This is tough going for our board to sort out applicability. So I think the first thing is in our A3, the range of engagements we're talking about. I am a little bit confused about the use of the word judged and by who that judgment is being made. So for example, in our D, and when must that judgment be performed? I would add, though, that in our paragraph A3, there really are 2 entities which for me are really strong issues that need to be made into a draft as soon as possible. The first is that the entity is a PI. And I, for one, don't understand why the progress of IAASB's topic holds us up from including this here, because IAASB isn't planning to change the word PI. They're planning to change the categorizations, and they're planning to give a lot of leeway to jurisdictions to continue to develop local definitions. I can't envisage how wherever IAASB lands, it's going to affect our views about what we scope out here. So the 5th category that I'm looking forward to adding is the entities of PI. The 6th category I'm looking forward to adding, and I would be interested in a rebuttal, it would be those audits that are joint audits. I would imagine that for fundamental reasons, this standard can't be applied in those circumstances. But and so would look forward to seeing it in there. The next comment I want to make is that I think that around applicability, we need to talk about what others described as transition. I want to talk about conversion. That somewhere in this section, we will need to explain that to convert this standard, an audit done under this standard, into an ISA audit only involves incremental effort, and that none of the work already done would go to waste. That you actually don't have to start the audit from scratch again. And I think that's a crucial behavioral issue that will help practitioners with if we dealt with that. So in doing so, we'll show how they work together, but also to manage the performance risk. That after the practitioner starts the engagement, she discovers that, the ISAs would have been better placed here, but she feels like she's stuck in this standard. And I think we need to be able to make that clear that it doesn't matter if you've done this much of planning and that much of work. You actually just need to do the incremental work to move on to that, even if you are en route. And that's possible that you make the determination while the engagement is on. The next one is just this general theme around judgment. And I have quite a strong view about it. That the slide that's up on the screen at the moment has judgment in this big blue block. And I'm concerned why this determination needs to be a judgment to the extent to which we have wired judgment into the standard. It is a very basic determination that every practitioner must be able to perform and arrive at the identical answer. If two practitioners looking at the same engagement should be able to apply the rule and say, this engagement falls within the scope of the standard. If that is not possible, the regulatory impact and market impact of it will be, number one, customers will start shopping around between firms who are prepared to use the standard. If they go to a firm who says, I have to use the full ISAs, they say, but if I go somewhere else, I'll be able to get it done cheaper. They'll use the other standard. That level of judgment in the marketplace will render the ISAs problematic and will cause chaos because people will shop around and there'll be market disruption caused by it. The second one, regulators will contest whether the basis of the audit is the right one. And it will draw doubts about the audit opinion. We can't have an inspector's judgment go against a firm's judgment on which standard applied to this audit. It is such a fundamental question. And that's why when you say we need some guidance here, I believe that less judgment, clearer lines about what's in and out is what's going to be necessary in order to close this gap. And lastly, if we leave this level of judgment in here, Kai, we will no doubt increase the expectation gap here as users will be confused. What kind of audit does this entity need? They're going to ask that question, what kind of audit does this entity need? There is an absolute need for this to be precise. I don't think that this is an art. This is one area of the work where it needs to be precise. I think that around the description of the characteristics and the blue blocks and such things, others have described earlier on in response to the earlier question that A5 introduces this whole conversation as saying these are the activities that would fall within the applicability of the standard, but then tends to describe things that would make the entity fall outside the applicability of the standard. So I encourage you to you'd want to look at that, please. A comment about the blue blocks. And I appreciate that this is the second bite we're having at this. The blue blocks don't describe audit effort. They describe something else. And I can't imagine why we would have audit effort being tailored to suit categorization. It would seem to be the wrong way around that we're approaching that. I would reverse that. And with that said, your task force will very easily be able to pick up all of these things that describe high or basic, these descriptions that are extremely judgmental and for the reasons that I described earlier are going to result in inconsistent application of what is a high-risk product, what is a highly regulated industry. An experienced engagement partner will always say no, or maybe an experienced engagement partner will always say yes. And this is an interesting comment through my own standard setting team. Really picked this up and said, but we will never be able to apply this consistently because we all understand how engagement partner views of this differ from firms' views of this, differ to engagement teams' views of this. And it's too fundamental a matter to be left out in this way. I also thought that one further clarification is needed about the blue blocks when you address the other matters, and that is the relationship between the 4 blocks. Are these or conditions? Are they and conditions, or are they and or conditions? And the fact that we're asking it suggests that, that's an area that may need to be resolved. And while you're doing that, whether there isn't a need for a fifth block. And that fifth block, as I heard from a group of stakeholders, is a description of reporting requirements. That if there could reporting requirements drive the type of engagement that this needs to be. Last but not least is the use of basic accounting estimates. I think we may have heard others say this earlier, who spoke earlier, the experience of the partner versus the experience of the staff, the first year of the engagement versus the sixth year of the engagement. The view about whether the estimate is basic or not can evolve in that way. And so this as the basis on which to hang the flag, this is an LCE audit, is too subjective, or if you like, it's a new concept that further complicates the scope and further complicates audits. Lastly, there are some topics that need to be addressed in applicability. And I think this is the area where, Kai, we're being constructive as to what we're going to need to get to the end. I think that a comment about the skills of practitioners is going to be necessary around applicability, a comment in relation to comparatives, a comment related to where are the bright lines about when the standard is prohibited to be used? Are there circumstances when it's prohibited to use? And then crucially, which this section is missing at the moment, is ethical considerations in making this determination. We have to appreciate that commercial considerations are going to drive this. We heard that in feedback on our consultations. We heard back at the conferences that the fee is too small. That's why we need a standard that will allow us to do this. The role of fees can't be the basis on which the standard is chosen, because then we're going to be on a race to the lowest common denominator and to poor quality audits. And so a really prominent conversation about how ethics should drive this selection, I believe is necessary to avoid that consequence. Thanks so much.
Yosh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the task force and Kai Morton. I have an applicability. I understand the reality, as mentioned by the Willie and Tom, especially that there is a high needs for the LCE standards especially from the SMP groups. I heard that the first time to hear that needs at the 2017 March meeting. But about the applicability, in addition to the exclusion of the listed entities, we as a regulator, we strongly urge that decision as to whether the standards can be applied has to be left to each jurisdiction. At least in Japan especially, it is difficult to adapt the ISA for LCE at this time, but we hope that such task force policy will be maintained. However, when professionals decide whether ISA for LCE is applicable or not, it might be possible that their decision may vary from the one professional to another, even within the same jurisdiction. So if it is possible, I think the entities to be excluded should be clearly specified. For example, financial institutions should be explicitly excluded in these standards. While we understand that task force position of not prescribing whether or not to exclude PIEs because of this definition of PIEs is different in each jurisdiction, and also understand that the task force will reconsider based on development in the IAASB project to define PIEs. So the issue of whether or not to exclude PIEs needs to be considered in this standard setting process by the task force. That is, thank you.
Thank you, Yash. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I support the general direction that the IAASB provides a principle-based framework and allow the jurisdiction to determine the scope that is appropriate in the jurisdiction circumstances. And with regard to applicability, I have a comment on two areas. And one is about group audit from a different angle. When a group auditor conducts a group audit in accordance with ISAP and requests a component auditor to perform work at component, I wonder whether the component auditor has an option to perform their work for the purpose of group audit in accordance with ISAP for LCE if a component is a less complex entity. I do not think perhaps it is necessary to prohibit the application of ISAP for LCE for the component auditor because the level of assurance should be the same. But I think there may be some discussion as to whether it is permissible or not. So I therefore think certain guidance should be introduced to understand whether it is fine or not. And the second area is about a characteristic of an audit of an LCE, that is paragraph A5. Firstly, the description in the blue box on page 6 says it would not be considered the governance structure of a less complex entity where they are multifaceted. I think the example provided there were added to respond to my offline comment in previous board meeting as to the meaning of multifaceted. And thank you very much for, providing the example, because now I understood what it means. And now I'm wondering whether there is a relevance between the complexity of an audit and the governance structures as explained there, because it seems to suggest that if the entity has a robust governance structure, the audit becomes complex. But I do not think it is necessarily the case. And in addition, I think the auditor of LC can often use a substantive approach and does not need to rely on control, even if the entity has, complex structure. So therefore, the audit of LCE with multifaceted governance structure does not necessarily become complex. And secondly, at paragraph A5, I think the descriptions about basic accounting estimates need some revisions. For example, in the first sublet in the second blue box on page 7, it said it's relevant to accounting estimate that may be uncomplicated because the business activities are simple. And it seems to suggest that if the entity's business activities are simple, the required estimates for that entity are basic. But I do not think it is necessarily true. I also think the characteristic about entities' business activities is already addressed in the blue box on page 6, and therefore is not necessary. Rather, with regard to accounting estimate, perhaps I think it would be helpful if we could explain about a basic estimate based on past results. I think this is also helpful as well because the description currently included in the box seems to be heavily focused on financial instruments. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Seshko. Isabel.
Yes, thank you. Thinking back at the discussion we just had, and at the slide that Kai you provided with the mountain, it remembered me this quote from Mandela: "After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb." That's true, but also to find that there are many more hills to climb, you need to have already climbed the first hill. So I reiterate my support to the task force for the great work that has been done. And all the comments I will be raising now are just to help to scope properly the draft. But still, I want to be very clear that I strongly support the draft. So on the exclusions, exclude listed. Yes, we have to exclude listed. I know we will disappoint few people, but on the opposite, not excluding them will not be in the public interest, and we would disappoint even more people. So yes, we have to exclude listed. Excluding pi would be more complex. I come from a jurisdictions where pi are very clearly defined, but I know that in some other jurisdictions, it's not as clear as that. So I acknowledge with the position of the task force for the moment not to expand to the exclusion of pi until the ISBA project has landed. I was interested by the point raised by Imran on group audit, on joint audit. You know, in France, joint audit is in our DNA, so we do not even see it because it's just part of our daily life. But I think that's something to do, and I would agree to exclude it for joint audit. In France, joint audit is mandatory for group audit. So for me, it's really linked to what we say on the topic of group audit. But why not? There is some voluntary joint audit. It's not always very efficient. So it could be a good line to draw and exclude it for joint audit. Why not? What would be difficult, however, is that we have nowhere for the moment the concept of joint audit in the ISAs. It used to be in the old introduction to 600, was removed, was supposed to be pushed into 20, was removed, and it's landing somewhere in the air, and we're waiting till it lands in the conforming change of 220 with 600. Then should we exclude group audit? And it's not easy, this question, because currently the meaning of group is first an undefined concept, and around the table of the IAASB, it's also a moving target. It's an undefined concept because, of course, when you think of a group, you think at legal aspect, mother entity, subsidiaries, branches, that makes a group. But then you add to that some additional cultural aspects. Some people may feel that a group is always very centralized, management is centralized, processes, internal control systems are centralized, there is a single auditor culture. And in some other parts of the world, it's not at all that. A group is just an addition of very dissimilar entities. And so it's difficult because when you think of a group, not everybody is thinking at the same thing. And also around the IAASB table, if you remember, we had a new definition that was proposed in draft ISA 600. And I strongly disagreed with this definition in December. It was really a very, very important point to us. If you remember, it was scoping in the scope of group, the coffee shop next door, because the coffee shop next door was selling coffee and tobacco, and they had to follow their books to have a subledger, one for each activity, and it was falling in the scope of a group. So I don't know exactly what we call a group, so it's difficult to conclude on that. Our answer is that we believe that a group with a legal definition should be clearly excluded from ISA 600. And regarding the definition of the draft ISA 600 and what could be scoped in and if a single entity could be scoped in, I am looking forward for the discussion we will have on Thursday. But having spoke to the task force, I know that we are about to find a solution to solve it. Last point regarding the criteria on IT and governance. On IT, we were surprised because we have the feeling when we look at the descriptions that the more the system is automated, the less complex is the entity. And we believe it should just be the opposite. If you have a very automated system, it may be very complex. It's not because it does not feel complex from the outside, but it's not. And last point, and we are forming again the French-Japanese team with Sachiko. We also struggled with governance. And when we read the criteria on the governance structure, there's a description, but we don't know what's the scale. Is it the more you have this criteria, you are complex, or the less you have this criteria, you are complex? We did not get it. So thank you very much, and happy to climb with you the next hills.
Lots of mountain and hill references today, if nothing else. Lynn.
Yeah, I'd just like to remind you that it was a New Zealander who knocked Everest off. So that's my contribution in terms of hills. While I was very positive to begin with, this is the one area where I do have major concerns. And my overriding comment is I don't think that the current information as set out will lead to consistent application of this material. And so I think it needs to be tightened up. I agree A3 is clear. We can have agreements and disagreements about what's in that list, but I would certainly like to see pies added to it. In terms of the middle area with judgment, I'd just like to turn to the public sector, and I'm sure, and I know you haven't dealt with it yet, but I looked at this through the lens of the public sector and my previous portfolio, and my assessment of working through all the criteria was I had 6 listed entities, so I knew they didn't apply. I had 2.5 truly tiny entities, 2,500, knew it applied to those. But the 500 in the middle, I was uncertain at the end whether the criteria worked for me. And if I can pick out some of those criteria, which caused me particular grief, agreeing with Sachiko and Isabel about the multifaceted governance structures. I think Jim said this is going to be hard for the public sector. I don't think I know any public sector organisation that doesn't have a multifaceted governance structure. And so I don't think that is going to work in the public sector. Moving on to information systems, and I'm not being comprehensive, I'm just picking out examples. The multiple or multifaceted IT applications are in almost every entity that I used to audit. And so I didn't think that was a differentiating. And finally, my major concern is with the basic accounting estimates, and a number of people have said this previously, but in particular, the dot point about active markets, the one of a high degree of uncertainty, and the fact that the model is common, is widely known or widely used, don't help me at all. In fact, they worry me because a lot of actuarial models are widely used, but they're extraordinarily complex. So I have my major concerns are in terms of the accounting estimates. Before I conclude, I would like to pick up a point that I missed in the previous discussion. And that is the fact that the importance for users and stakeholders to understand the difference between this kind of audit and an ISA audit. And I think this particular part is vital in coming to that understanding. So there is clarity and consistency in what's in and what's out. Thank you very much, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. Kai also agreed that this is one of the most critical areas to really spend time thinking about whether you are in or out. The only comment on the first box is similar to what Sashiko said about group audits, and if a component could use LCE and also use ISAs, or what happens in terms of reporting. And on the box in the middle, it's clear to me that we're talking about ISA 315 and 540 here. The three bullets are pretty much over there. So I think in practice, in reality, if you have a very good understanding of those standards, if you have used them, struggled really with the understanding of the business, getting involved in the system, trying to learn how it works, the transactions, the flow, the size of the department, number of people, and same with accounting estimates, inherent risks, subjectivity, uncertainty, it shouldn't really be a problem for someone with experience to make a quick decision whether or not you are in or out of LCE. I think this is a process similar to key audit matters. You, in practice, you know where you spend your time and where you struggle a lot. And if you tend to spend more time deciding whether or not the engagement is an LCE, probably you are not. This should be pretty quick. Basic understanding of the business, clear understanding of the systems, and deciding whether or not the estimates are basic. I struggle a little bit with parts of the standard because it seems like requirements in the risk assessment area are making us spend a lot of time in terms of the system. And I probably do not agree that that's the spirit of where we want to go. But it seems a little bit contradictory that the system is pretty simple, and then you have to spend a lot of time doing the understanding and the assessment. And the same with the accounting estimates. Once you start thinking about, is this estimate a significant risk? Then we're talking about complexity, uncertainty, bias, something that shouldn't really be present in a basic accounting estimates. I think the appendix 3, if I'm not wrong, helps a lot in terms of really saying, yes, I'm here, I'm here. I know the estimates have evolved. Maybe what we consider very complex 10 years ago now is not. It has to do a lot with also the knowledge in terms of accounting. For many of auditors, we don't really get involved in very detailed and complex estimates. But if we have the knowledge, maybe we don't really consider that to be a complex estimate. We can easily deal with that, do the documentation, exactly understand what we need to do, and may place us in the LCE project. So it's going to be really difficult to ensure consistency 100% here. And that's because the knowledge is going to be different across practitioners. The other item I just noticed is, which is not really actually here in the applicability, but there's a part, I think in the next chapter, that talks about ISQM2. And I was just wondering if we are, if an LCE engagement, for some reason, it's in a point where an EQR it's needed, maybe we're not really talking about an LCE. And I wasn't really quite sure how the ISQM2 should really link here, because I see that as a response from the firm where you have more risk. So more risk probably implies more complexity, and I wasn't really quite sure if that's a discussion that should be very specific here in the standard to be able for an engagement in terms of using ISQM2 when we're having an LCE engagement. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just mindful of time, and I'm not going to cut matters short, but I'm also respectful of those in time zones that it is very late. It's 6:56 my time here. Would people be willing to go 10 minutes over, and then I think we call it a pause for the night? We are returning to this tomorrow morning. Does that make sense? Is 10 minutes, since you're up here, but I don't want to take much more time than that. And then we'll continue tomorrow. Sue.
Thanks, Tom. The one area on applicability that came up very consistently in the outreach I did was around groups, as I mentioned earlier, and perhaps different to others was in the environments where we have statutory audit requirements for the vast majority of companies. You will have a lot of small groups, literally holding company and maybe 2 or 3 subsidiaries, all of which would meet the other criteria for an LCE, and they are being scoped out simply because of the structure, and people drawing the contrast between some of the perhaps a much larger standalone company with the judgmental areas, and as Fernando's just said, perhaps an EQCR and so on, which feels a lot more complex. And the discussion was really, as I mentioned earlier, potentially hampering the uptake of the standard in some of those jurisdictions or by firms. I did ask in the outreach what kind of approach people would prefer if we were talking about building groups in, because the kinds of options could be things like a cross-reference to 600 in the same way as we have for ISQM2 and so on, or to incorporate within the standard. And I'm afraid it probably wasn't desperately helpful, and it was about a 50-50 split either way. But there was also the possibility of supplemental guidance. But I think I would encourage the task force to consider the simple group aspect, because I think it possibly is important to the success of the standard. Thanks.
Thank you. Edda?
Yes, thank you, Tom.
Oh, I muted you by accident. I was in your box until I had moved, so I accidentally muted myself, muted you.
Okay, I think I'm on now. Right, so I think I'm to a large extent in the same place where Imran sits. I think the standard needs to be sufficiently robust that different practitioners end up at the same place as to whether a specific entity is in or out. Imran mentioned shopping around. I had written down race to the bottom, because companies may start shopping around for the one auditor that may make the judgment that it is in or out. Well, and as it comes to the judgment, we're using relatively judgmental words. Well, basic accounting estimates. I've made the comments before about the complex models that I don't think need to be in. And I just wanted to react on a comment that Fernando made, because Fernando referred to knowledge that the auditors would have on the basis of knowledge of the broader standards, 315 and 540. But I thought this standard was meant to be read to be able to be read in isolation and still deliver the quality that it's intended for. As I mentioned before, I'm concerned that very large entities potentially would be in here, and I would then struggle with this. On groups, I agree with where the task force has landed, and firmly agree. I have a lot of sympathy of taking public interest entities out, and probably by reference to the local definition, appreciating, of course, Isabel's concern that it may not be defined consistently everywhere, but by its very nature, a public interest entity, I think, should be out. Yeah, I think and then the other consideration that I wanted to bring is should this be left to the individual practitioner, or should this potentially be to some extent baked in the quality standards or the quality management system of the firm? That's something that I'm thinking about, and then the professional will have, of course, the construct of ISQM1 and ISO 220 to consider the direction that the firm is providing. So those were my comments, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And like some others, I'm very much in the camp of trying to minimize the situations where different auditors are going to reach different decisions on this material in terms of whether they're in or out. I had similar comments as others around the governance and the IT systems criteria, and particularly trying to understand whether something is meant to indicate complexity or less complexity. And in many cases, it seems it could be either. The couple of other comments or characteristics to think about. We did not see anything in there about management judgments. Presumably, if management is making judgments that would potentially, make the audit more complex. I know that we sort of talk about estimation uncertainty, and maybe that's really what we're intending there. But there could be management judgments that are not related to estimation uncertainty, possibly. We also were asking how, if on the one hand, the audits, some audits that have high degree of estimation uncertainty are excluded, and yet we've got in the standard itself quite a lot of material around going concern and dealing with the material uncertainty related to the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. So there seemed to be a bit of a disconnect there. Maybe just cover a couple of other ones. The one about in the IT system where it talks about the volume of data, and it wasn't entirely clear to us why the volume of data necessarily affects complexity. It's really the systems and processes around the data that seem to be more important. But I'll leave it there. I think most of my other comments have been covered by other people. Thanks.
Thank you. Len.
Thank you, Tom. Kai, this is a huge area for the task force. I understand the challenges you're going through in coming up with the applicability criteria. So couple of thoughts. Drawing from ISO 600 experience, the task was going for a more bright line approach, at least looking at 600, because that's what the commenters and a lot of stakeholders is is asking us to make sure that standards are applied consistently. So when you look at 600, it's more brighter line. So when I look at what you have here, a lot of judgment, and one of the elements of audit quality is consistency in applying the auditing standards. So looking at audit quality, as many people have said in their opening remark, I think this judgment piece is going to be challenging. We struggle with 600. When I look at the characteristics, Ada has already said, it seems to be going different direction away from consistency. More importantly, when I look at the basic accounting estimate, as others have said, I'm just thinking about other accounting, for example, revenue recognition, going concern, whether we should take the IFRS SME approach for our standards. I think that may require a separate visit. But lastly, I want to talk about, I heard a lot of comments about group audit, and I just want to make sure that people understand that ISO 600 is a special consideration, and also it's a standard looking at audits of group financial statements. So some people raise the terms statutory audits and component audit. I think they're for a different purpose. So we're very focused on group audits from a group auditor perspective. So I think if we want to take the task force position to scope out and have some emphasis as a question or in the memo to go with the exposure draft or whichever document you decide to call it, we have to be very, very clear in terms of what we mean group audit to scope out, because I'm hearing different views and we may not be all on the same page. So that's it, Tom. That's my comments.
Okay. Two more to go. Josephine?
Thank you. I'll keep it brief because a lot has already been said. I'm in the same place as Ada and Imran regarding the concerns on shopping around. I think there's definitely some guidance needed in the standard on documenting rationale, and that's both from the perspective of management and the conversation you'll have with management when you're setting terms of engagement and describing the ISA describing the audit under this standard. And we did some of that in 2400, so there could be a bit of easy copying and pasting there. And then I also agree regarding the confusion now that we have on if the practitioner comes in with full ISA knowledge or if they are in a standalone scenario. So that might be the case in the first few years, but then 10 years down the line, does a person come in and only have the LCE standard knowledge and not all the application material and the full ISA knowledge? That where are we starting from? So we really need to be clear about what we're doing from that perspective. I agree with Ada completely that we're scoping in too many entities into what we have now. So with that regard, I absolutely agree with the task force decision to scope out groups. I absolutely agree that PIEs should be included in here, and I think we should use IAASB, as I said before, because they've worked very hard on thinking about, making sure those really tiny PIEs aren't part of that collection, and we should use the work they've done. I did actually like some of the ideas that we're putting to the professional judgment, but I think there's still too much scope for judgment. I think we should be a bit more precise on what we mean here. And that might mean that there's very little judgment. You're either in or not, depending on what the standard says. So certainly we shouldn't be including those more complex estimates, which I talked about before. Think about observable market prices, measurement and recognition, governance structures. I mean, it would probably be easier to just say you don't have an audit committee and start from there and then put out a discussion paper on that basis or whatever we put as a wrapper. And then I actually liked some of the ideas around the information system, which is contrary, I agree to some of the other board members. I thought that they were quite good. I thought there was some slight contradictions, because there was suggestion that there was huge volume of data that might go through. And I think we're in large entities again, and I don't think that's what we're aiming for. So I'm just trying to be really, really brief. There were some other points that others made, but those are the main points I wanted to make, and I had already talked about this. So thank you.
Thank you. Diane, last but definitely not least.
Yep, and I'll be quick. Estimates. So, there's a reason that this is a focus of the FER, and I understand that we're talking about LCEs, but I do think estimates is an area that continues to give auditors quite a bit of challenge. And what I'm going to show my cynicism here as an old auditor. My fear is that the auditor rationalizes that it is a non-complex estimate. It's a routine estimate, and they dismiss it, so to speak. And they do that so that they have the ability to use the LCE standard. But really behind the curtain, the estimate is quite complex. And that if the auditor truly understood what are the assumptions, what are the objective elements, what is the degree of management judgment, what is the interplay of the IT system, do experts need to be involved? My experience has been many times an estimate is much more complex than you first realize. And it isn't until you get into it that you begin to realize, oh, shoot, this is a little bit more involved than I thought. So my only caution would be giving some extra belts and suspenders around how do you qualify whether that truly is a non-complex, a simple estimate. And when I look at Appendix 3, the only two that I kind of could even get close on is depreciation, but then you still have to challenge whether the useful life, and you've got certain industries that may have salvage values and things like that. And then allowance for doubtful accounts, and you would think, gosh, that's a simple one, but there are estimates. And the level of findings that still come out of inspections when you're dealing with allowance for doubtful accounts can still be amazing. So, but all the other ones are complex, inventory obsolescence, how that's used, cycle count programs, or even if it's a simple, what reserve percentages are they using? So I just would caution us to put a little bit more of a ring fence around estimates in particular. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. A lot there, but it builds off the next section. I saw let me see if I could summarize some of it and let Kai and team respond. I think there's a general theme that there's unease with maybe the breadth of judgment and just the general breadth of applicability of the standard based upon why it's articulated today. That's relatively broad across the board. Particularly the most clarity is people have been focusing on the pie concept. I don't want to limit this task force from its consideration, but many people suggested that pie should not be included. And I know the task force considered that issue in full, and there's a rationale for why they landed where they are. But that was a top theme that I heard quite strongly, and maybe some of the broader concerns, fundamental concerns, reduced as you narrow the scope and applicability of the standard. There's lots of talk about knowledge of ISAs and what you do with it, and the standalone. Standalone document. I actually think it's more of a standalone requirement. You can't eliminate knowledge; it doesn't exist. But there is some thoughts around that. Greater precision about the extent of judgment being applied, and estimates came up repeatedly. So those were the key areas that I noted in my notes as it went around the room. And as I said, the top one was really on this issue of what to be mandatorily scoped out, because the more defined you are, the less variability in application you'll get, is sort of what I was hearing. And appropriateness of the standard too. Kai, I don't know if you took away different themes. As I said, I'm not trying to judge the outcome, but that's what I took away as summary points.
Yeah, I think I have the same on my list. In addition to that, I have a couple of people bringing up fee consideration and race to the bottom. I think we just need to remind ourselves that we're not doing this project to reduce the audit fees. We're trying to develop a standard that that be more applicable for them, so that they focus on getting the reasonable assurance. So it's not, I don't think we should be caught up in the fee discussion around this, and that the standard would be drive a race to the bottom. That's kind of indicative that we have a lower quality in a way. But I think, as you said, the standalone set of the standard, we did have a discussion on that in December, and at that point we decided that we should try to develop this as a standalone standard, including the requirements necessary to get reasonable assurance, and that we wouldn't require or require the full ISA background in a way. Not forgetting that the ISAs are there, and it's an important part. We are basing this on the ISAs, but it should be judged on its own. As you said on the PIE, I heard the input here. I think we had the same input multiple times before, but also on different direction. The reason for not being included is that the PIEs are differently defined in each jurisdiction. And in our mind, that is something that should be left to the jurisdictions when they decide to implement the standard or not, to further limit it. Also, if you are a PIE, most likely you would not be able to qualify as a less complex entity in the judgment areas. You will have characteristics that will make you fall out of that part. So we felt that if you are a PIE, you will most likely be scoped out anyway, at least in the complex areas. And then we got some feedback on the judgment area. I think if we are to exclude judgment from the applicability of the standard, the only way we could do that is by going the size criteria and numbers of revenue or employees, and I think that's the only time you can do that is when you go into an individual jurisdiction and try to implement the standard. Other than that, I think there will be some judgment in deciding if you can use the standard or not, and that's why also we have the documentation requirements to document the judgment and the rationale behind the decision to use the standard. So that's the way that we tackle that. I think we got some feedback on the estimates. The reason, the background for having the characteristics is to give indicators of where complexity could appear. So it's not the one-to-one list that if you have one, you automatically out, or if you have none of them, you're automatically in. It's something that you need to consider and to see if they, based on that you would still be less complex or not. I think then that I've addressed some of the major comments that came up.
I think on the pie point, though, I think there was sort of an acceptance of what your argument was, but some pushback on it, though, as well. So obviously, you'll have to proceed with the knowledge that lots of members of the board understood that point, but also we're still pushing back on it. Again, that's just something for task force deliberation, but in terms of guidance, I felt like there was some consistency there. But a really good session today. We have a big one tomorrow again on this topic, 3 hours. We will get through as much as we could get through. That's the idea. I could say to Sue, from audit evidence, whatever spare time we need now or gain in another topic, we'll probably use for LCE. So audit evidence is off the hook. So pretending upon the hour, you probably enjoy that relief. But great discussion. We always knew this would be hard. Of course, when you see the writing, it gets hard. And we come with this with an open mind. So thank you for everyone. have a good night. And for those who it is night, and for those who are early in the day, have a great day, and I'll catch you up in the next section when we hit LCEs. Anything, Billy, from an administrative standpoint you want to say beforehand, or are we good for tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. my time?
Yes, no, Tom, I think we're good for tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. And I think Michelle did send out the links for board members that will join the happy hour session tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. Great, good stuff. Thank you to the task force and Bev and Vicky for all your hard work. Again, universal acclaim. Thank you. And I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.